How are you feeling? No, really, how are you feeling?
My name is Bridget. I'm 39 years old and I live on my own. I am lonely a lot.
For the first time in my life, I have really felt what loneliness feels like, and I have to say it's freaking awful.
I haven't always been lonely, I like being by myself, but I find that a lot of the times loneliness comes from being in a big group of people but not really connecting with anyone.
Loneliness is a really misunderstood word, and it's possibly one of the ones we've been hearing the most from people in 2020. Some people think that loneliness means being alone. It doesn't. You can be lonely in a house full of people, in a relationship, in a family, in a marriage, in a group chat, in a workplace. Loneliness is something that happens in your heart and your head, and it can also have very real implications to your physical and mental health. And has there ever been a year when more people felt more lonely? Unlikely. So we wanted to do an episode on loneliness because it really does feel like the other pandemic. We'll be hearing from you, our No Filter listeners, throughout this episode about how loneliness has impacted you. And I also want you to meet my guest, who has accidentally become an expert on loneliness and what to do about it. From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, a weekly interview podcast with people who tell their stories very candidly and aren't afraid to be all kinds of vulnerable.
So we are in Miami, Florida at the moment. This is actually where I grew up. My wife and our kids and I.
Dr. Vivek Murthy was the Surgeon General of the United States from 2014 to 2017. During Barack Obama's second term. And essentially that means he was America's doctor, and it was his job, pre-COVID, to deal with the country's most urgent public health issues.
Procedures and wear masks when you go outside, distance, all of that kind of stuff.
And when he left that job, he found himself afflicted very badly by loneliness in a way that made him want to understand it better so that he could help others with chronic stress and isolation. Earlier this year, he released a fantastic book. It's called Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. It's about the silent epidemic of loneliness, and he joins me now to talk about it. There's so much focus on death tolls and economic impact of COVID, but can you tell me a little bit about what you've noticed of the silent epidemic, and that is of loneliness?
It's a great question, Mia, because I don't think that the social health impact of COVID-19 is nearly as understood or appreciated as the economic impact and the health impact. But one of the things that I came to see when I was Surgeon General, when I was traveling around the country and meeting people from around the world and hearing their stories of what concerned them, is I came to realize that loneliness was a far more common concern for people than I had appreciated. And it was, very different. It wasn't like people coming up to me and saying, hi, my name is Jonathan, I'm lonely, or my name is Sarah, I'm struggling with loneliness. They would never really say that. And that's a whole other topic of why is there so much stigma around loneliness. But what they would say were things like this. I feel like I have to deal with all of these burdens in my life by myself. Or I feel if I disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice, or I feel invisible. And keep in mind, I was hearing this not just from people who were older and who were living alone. I was hearing this from college students who were living in dorms surrounded by many, many other students. I was hearing this from parents who had relationships with neighbors and others in their community, but still felt isolated. I was hearing it from CEOs of companies, from teachers, from doctors, and from members of Congress here in Washington, D.C., where I live, who would tell me behind closed doors when cameras weren't around that they too struggled with loneliness. And so hearing all of that well before COVID arrived on the scene, I was already deeply concerned about how common loneliness was, but also about how consequential it was, because it turns out that people who struggle with loneliness are in fact at increased risk of physical and mental health concerns, including premature death and dementia, but also depression and anxiety. So now enter COVID-19. And what has happened is this extraordinarily stressful event that has turned our lives upside down and has introduced great uncertainty because we don't know when it's going to end. That has been accompanied by these restrictions on our seeing each other, which is ironic because at a time of great stress and uncertainty, what we normally turn to are people in our life, because our relationships are one of our greatest sources of stress relief. And so I think that the ensuing loneliness that has for many people increased in their life, I think has been really quite destructive and difficult to manage. I'll lastly say though, I do think that it doesn't have to be this way. I actually believe that we can take one of two paths here with COVID. We can either allow it to deepen our loneliness and our separation from one another. And if we do so, I think we will incur what I think of as a social recession, if you will, one that is marked by deepening loneliness and one that has consequences, I think, that are just as important and weighty as the economic headwinds we may be facing. But I think the other path that we can go down is that we can use this moment as an opportunity for social revival. We can use it to step back, take stock of our lives, and ask ourselves what really matters to us, what makes our life meaningful and worth living. And for so many people, it's become clear to them during this time of separation in COVID that our relationships are deeply important to us, perhaps more important than many of us realize on a day-to-day basis. But if we can step back and ask ourselves how we can rebuild our lives around our relationships and truly put people first, I think there's a chance we could come out of this pandemic more deeply connected to one another, more resilient, and ultimately more fulfilled than before COVID arrived.
Hey guys, it's Ebony here and I'm from Brizzy. I am 26 and I am a senior account manager in a full service creative agency and recently bought my own home in February this year. For the first time in my life, I have really felt what loneliness feels like, and I have to say it's freaking awful. I come from a massive family. I have lived in New York and I've lived in London, both places of which I moved to by myself. But when I was there, the focus was all on my job and learning and meeting new people, so there was never really any time to stop and think. As I mentioned, I bought my house in February, so that was right before COVID got bad here in Brisbane. Coming home and not having anyone here, it's really hard. I've always been a very, very independent person, but when you come home and you know how many things you have ahead of you, it's exhausting. I think just knowing that there's no one else here to pick up the slack for you if you just don't feel like doing it is a shit feeling. I have lots of friends and, as I mentioned, a huge family, but it's shit. It's really shit sometimes. I definitely think COVID has made things harder in terms of not being out and about. My work is very social, so a lot of that social fix I got from my work and my work friends. But since we've sort of been working from home, it's felt incredibly isolating, and I wouldn't wish the feeling upon anyone.
There will be people listening to this who wouldn't use the word lonely to describe how they feel. But what are some of the other ways that loneliness can show up? What are some of the other feelings that people might have and not identify it as loneliness?
Loneliness is a great masquerader. It looks like so many different things. I think this is one of the reasons why people look around and they say, gosh, no one else seems to be lonely. It seems like maybe it's just me. Because loneliness can sometimes look like depression or anxiety. It can look like anger and short-temperedness, as it often does among men. It can look like withdrawal. It can look like boredom, interestingly. It can look like different things. And even to the person experiencing it, it may not be clear exactly what you're going through. And that's why I find this conversation about loneliness to be so important, because I think if we all look at our lives, we'll realize that there have been points at which all of us have experienced loneliness. And it doesn't mean that we are dysfunctional or that we're broken or that we're losers in any way, but it's a common part of the human experience, just like hunger and thirst are. And the parallel there is that hunger and thirst are signals, natural signals, right? That we want our body to send us when we're lacking something we need for survival. And it turns out that loneliness is the same thing. It's a signal our body is sending us. It's something that we need for survival, which in fact is social connection, is missing. And if we choose to react to that by picking up the phone to call a friend or by getting in the car and going to visit someone we love, then that feeling of loneliness may subside. It's when it lasts for a prolonged period of time, either because we don't recognize it or because we can't figure out how to address it, that's when we start running into complications. And that's where loneliness can enter into a downward spiral where it begets even more loneliness.
One of my biggest aha moments from your book, Together, which I just loved so much and which you wrote in such a prescient way before the pandemic and which came out just in the most perfect time. You talk about the 3 levels of loneliness: intimate, friends, and community. Can you explain a little bit about what those 3 different levels are?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you why these are actually really critical to understand, because you might actually misplace blame for relationship troubles if you don't understand this. So it turns out that we need different types of connection in our life. And when we miss these different types of connection, we experience different types of loneliness. So one type of loneliness is intimate loneliness, when we're missing a connection with somebody who's a trusted confidant. And that could be a spouse, it could be a best friend. And these are the kind of people who really know us, with whom we can be ourselves. We don't have to have any facade. We don't have to be somebody else. We can just be us. The second type of loneliness is relational loneliness. And that's when we're missing friendships, the kind of relationships with people with whom we may spend weekends and go out to dinner on a Friday night. These are the folks that we may have over for a barbecue or for a social gathering or birthday parties. And when we miss those friends, we experience relational loneliness. And the third type of loneliness is collective loneliness. It's when we miss being part of a community with which we have a shared identity or a common sense of purpose. And you may get that sense of community from a faith group that you're a part of, from a volunteer organization, even from work. If you feel a deep sense of connection to the mission at work and the people who are there for that mission. So when we miss those kind of connections and we feel that collective loneliness, and the reason I mentioned this is so important to understand is if you have a spouse who seems to be struggling with loneliness and you recognize that, you might think that it's your fault. Because after all, if you had a great relationship and it was a healthy relationship, why would your partner be lonely? But when you understand that people actually have these different needs in terms of relationships, you can understand how they may have wonderful, nourishing, intimate connections in their life, but they may struggle with relational or collective loneliness if they don't have strong friendships and don't feel like they're part of a community. And part of the reason I know this is not only because I've studied it, but because I've experienced that. And I have so blessed to have a wonderful wife, Alice, who I met working together, and she's an extraordinary spouse, and we are just great in so many ways. And so I've been very fulfilled in my relationship with her. But when I left government and I was no longer Surgeon General and was back in the community, I felt this real profound sense of loneliness. And it was because, in part, I didn't have the community around me that I had at work. And we were very mission driven. We had fun together. We took care of each other, but we were there for a purpose that we all believed in, which was to make the health of the nation better. And that community disappeared overnight. The other thing that I had missed, though, were my friendships, because during my time as Surgeon General, I had made a critical mistake. I had told myself that because I only have a limited amount of time here in this role, I want to do as much good as I can in the time that I have. So I want to put myself entirely into my work. And I neglected my relationships. I didn't call my friends nearly as much. I took forever to call them back when they did call, not because I didn't want to, because I prioritized work. And the consequence of that was I came out of that time in office and realized that even though I had friendships in theory, I wasn't experiencing friendships. And there's a difference between the two.
Tell me a little bit about that, because that's a big aha moment for me as well.
Yeah. So, and this is an aha moment that was gifted to me by a friend that I spoke to during that time. And I was telling her, in a moment of honesty and vulnerability, how I was really struggling and I felt like I was lonely. I didn't have friendships. And she looked at me, and this is a friend that I've known since my medical training days. She said to me, Vivek, your problem is, and she was smiling, she said, all of us still love you as your friends, those of us who were there in residency and after. She said, your problem isn't that you don't have friendships. The problem is you're not experiencing friendships. You're not picking up the phone to call them, to experience conversation. You're not coming to visit friends. You're not asking them to come visit you. You're not putting your life, into their worldview, and you're not inviting them to share their life with you. She's like, that is the experience of friendship that you used to do all the time, but you're not doing that. But the reason she raised that as such an important point is it's much easier to awaken a dormant friendship than it is to think about the challenge of finding a new person to build a new friendship with. And I think for many of us, if we look back at our lives, we may realize that there are relationships that we have that have now laid dormant, perhaps because of years of not talking or being with one another. But when you realize how extraordinarily common loneliness is, that 25% of people in Australia struggle with loneliness, that similar percentages in the UK, that even greater numbers in the US do, and in many other countries around the world, you start to realize that many of those friends who you no longer are in touch with are probably struggling with loneliness as well. And a simple message, a call, reaching out to them could be a lifeline for both of you.
My name is Bridget. I'm 39 years old and I'm single. I've been single for a very, very long time. Actually, never really had one of those proper actual relationships, so there's probably something wrong with me. But I am lonely a lot. I spend a lot of time on my own. All my friends are married. They all have kids, some very young kids, some kids are a bit older, but a lot of that burden of being around them comes on me. They don't ask me to be a part of their get-togethers because I don't have a partner to bring to entertain their husbands, and I don't have children to bring to entertain their children. So the value add that they see from me is minimal, and my family isn't particularly close. My brother lives in Sydney, my father lives on the coast. This pandemic's been quite hard on me because I can't go down and see my family in Sydney. My dad's a very high risk, so I can't go and see him. The loneliness is crushing sometimes. I see people in relationships and think how lovely that would be to have someone who you were their top priority, that you had someone who wanted to know how your day was, and to just be around. There's some things you just can't do, like going out for dinner on your own it feels so much more burdensome. I am fine with my own company, but at times I do want to be around people and want some company at times, and it's just not available. The expectation is by the time you're 40, you should really have a partner and you should really have kids, and that should be your support network. And if you don't have that, there's just not really an avenue for you.
A lot of my face-to-face contact with my friends has been replaced by group text messages, and even more so this year. Is that a real sense of connection, or is that a kind of like a false friendship?
Well, it's a great question, Maya. And I think that technology can be an extraordinarily powerful tool for connecting us and for enhancing our friendships. And so when you talk about group text threads, I'm reminded of a couple of group text threads I have with friends, which actually really enable us to share more deeply and regularly with each other. We still try to get together, in virtually, at least now on Zoom calls, so we can see each other. But those threads they're like the glue that keeps us connected, in between conversations. So I think they can be quite powerful. I think the challenge is, and I think one yardstick to use when you're measuring your online connection with others, is to ask yourself, how real am I being with this other person? And if your answer is, gosh, on these text threads, we're actually able to be really honest and open with each other, then that's wonderful. That could be an aid. Instead, if you find that on text threads or on, group conversations on Facebook or on other platforms, that you're sort of hiding behind a veneer, you're trying not to say as much, you're just not sharing, you're not being yourself, then that actually could be more of a problem. You could be having connection in the literal sense without truly experiencing fulfilling connection. And the truth is that a lot of us, myself included over the years, have put up with a lot of what I would think of as less fulfilling, lower quality engagement with other people, either because maybe I was too scared to look for something different, or the activation energy seemed too high to try to change everything up, and find a different way of interacting. But the truth is, how we feel, how real we can be, how vulnerable we can make ourselves in conversation. These are important markers of the quality of interactions. And I don't mean for this all to be serious. Humor is an important part of meaningful interactions as well. And being able to have fun banter with your friends is an important part of friendship as well. But I do think if we're honest with ourselves, we know that sometimes we're hiding behind something, a veil, something that prevents us from truly opening up and being ourselves. And that, to me, is a sign that you should question whether that is truly time that is well spent.
I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter with me and Vivek Murthy.
I'm an introvert and an only child, so I've been alone a lot during my life. I haven't always been lonely, like I like being by myself, but I find that a lot of the times loneliness comes from being in a big group of people but not really connecting with anyone, like at a party and you watch everyone else in conversation, laughing and just finding it so easy, and I'm just sort of sitting there like trying not to look at my phone.
Who's most at risk of becoming lonely and being lonely and the negative health impacts of being lonely?
Well, it's an interesting and important question. I think that in the world that we live in, which is an extroverted world, and it's an extroverted world because it tells us that if on a Friday night you're staying home and reading a book instead of out at a party, that somehow you're doing something wrong, or that if you show up in a movie theater and decide you want to treat yourself to a movie, but you're alone, that somehow something's wrong with you, right? Like our world tells us, it has a bias toward extroversion, and it tells us that when we're in groups, that's when we're doing it right from a social perspective. So in a world like that with an extroverted bias, people who are introverted are, I think, at greater risk of loneliness. Not because being an introvert in and of itself is risky, but because if you constantly feel like you're doing it wrong, that something is wrong with you because you don't want to be in large crowds all the time, and you keep forcing yourself to go to parties, but somehow you're not connecting with people. The message that you take away from a lot of that is, gosh, I don't know how to interact with people. I can't make friends. I'm just not doing it right. And then you can withdraw further and further as your esteem erodes more and more.
I was going to ask you about introverts because I think that's really true about how we live in an extroverted society with an emphasis towards people who are comfortable in that way. But among Gen Zs and millennials, I notice with my kids and some of the women I work with, introverts are having a real moment. Like there's something quite cool about being an introvert. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about the difference between being an introvert and becoming lonely. Like just spending more time on your own, is that more of a risk factor for loneliness, or it's not the same thing?
So I think if you're an introvert, and I say this as an introvert actually myself.
Yeah.
Are you one as well? Are you an introvert?
I'm getting to embrace my introvert. I think I'm becoming more of an introvert as I get older.
Interesting. Yeah, I find the same. It's been true for me. I think introverts, if they recognize what they need, which is often interactions in smaller groups, one-on-one interactions, and more alone time, more solitude, if they recognize and honor that, then I actually think introverts can live a perfectly connected life and can feel deeply fulfilled with one another. It's when we judge our needs because of an external standard that society sets that we run into trouble and that we run the risk of being lonely. But there are other groups that are at risk of being lonely as well. I think whenever you are in a situation where you are seen as an outsider because you don't speak the language, because your skin color is different, because your cultural traditions are different, because you look different in some other way, then that can put you at risk, certainly, for being lonely, especially if you are shy and you have a hard time breaking in to a group. The other, I think, thing that can put people at risk is, interestingly, is actually depression and anxiety, because there is a difficult cycle in a relationship between loneliness, depression, and anxiety. Loneliness increases the risk of depression and anxiety, but being anxious can actually often make social interaction harder. Depression can also make people withdraw more, which in turn can increase their loneliness, which gives rise to more depression. So you can see how this can become a very difficult cycle. And the other thing that can, I think, put people at risk for loneliness are cultural norms that prevent them from expressing their true feelings. Both men and women struggle with this, but I think about men in particular here, because the model of masculinity that many of us men have been brought up with is one that tells us that being a real man is about being self-sufficient, not relying on anyone else. It's about being strong in a way that means you don't show weakness, which means you don't show your feelings. And the truth is that men and women both have feelings. It's just a reality. It's a biological reality of who we are. So when you force people to suppress something that's a true expression of who they are, it can often manifest in loneliness. And that's why I think you find so many men who struggle silently with loneliness. And I mentioned earlier in this conversation, Maya, that one of the ways that loneliness masquerades in men in particular is anger and irritability. That's not a coincidence, because one of the few emotions that it's okay to express if you're a man is anger,
Mm.
right? If you think about that, like we don't fault a person and say that they're unmanly if they're angry, if that's how they express their dissatisfaction with the situation. But if they express their dissatisfaction by crying, then we'd say, oh, that person's not acting in a masculine way, right? And so anger is the one emotion that men are permitted to express. And when they struggle with loneliness, think about loneliness as a source of pain, because that's what it is. And the interesting thing about emotional pain is that it registers in the same place in our brain that physical pain registers, and can often feel the same way. It's why when people like have a very difficult emotional experience, like a sudden breakup or terrible news, they often say, I felt that in my gut.
Yeah.
It's quite literal too. It can feel like physical pain. And that's why actually there is, I believe, a relationship between the opioid epidemic that we're seeing in the United States and many countries around the world, and the rising rates of depression and anxiety and emotional pain that many people are experiencing. But I bring this up because as human beings, when we experience pain, physical or emotional, and loneliness is a form of pain, we will seek to relieve it, right? And what matters is what we reach for. So if I reach for the phone to call a friend, if I reach for my car keys to go visit someone I love, then that could be a great way to deal with that pain. If I reach, for my sneakers to go out and take a run because exercise helps lift my mood, that might also be a healthy way to deal with pain. But if I reach for food and sweets, and I say this as someone who loves sweets, then it may actually not be so good for me. If I reach for alcohol, if I reach for drugs as a way to numb that pain, then again, I may run into trouble, right? And so this is the way in which loneliness as a form of emotional pain, as an extremely common form of emotional pain, connects so deeply to so many of the frontline crises that we're reading about in the paper, whether it's the opioid epidemic, violence, whether it's alcoholism, or other challenges we have with depression, anxiety, and chronic disease.
One of the things that a lot of people reach for is social media, and particularly Facebook groups, which seems to have become the new form of community, both as sort of institutions like knowing your neighbours have devolved, and attendance at church and volunteer groups and all of those things that used to be such a part of people's lives. One of the features of those Facebook groups is that people can retreat into very polarised worldviews. How's that impacting, this current political polarisation that we have, when it's either you agree with me completely or you're dead to me? How's that impacting on loneliness?
This is a really interesting area that you brought up, Mia, because there's this notion of in-group and out-group connections. It's easy to think that because we, are connected to people who think just like us, look like just like we are, and have the exact same experience, that we are doing it right and that we're immune to loneliness. In the book, I actually share the story of an extraordinary friendship pair, actually. These two young men, one of whom was actually raised in the Ku Klux Klan, which is a white supremacy organization that has long and dark roots in the United States. And one of the things that he told me, I remember, is he said that for all those years growing up, he really felt like he had community. The fellow KKK members, they were there for him. He did like a trip where I think he drove, I think it was across America, and he stayed with KKK families all along the way. This was a real community for him. But I think what we've seen is that even though our tendency over time has been to associate with people like us, that in the modern world, where we're increasingly crossing paths with people who are different from us, that there is great danger to ourselves and to others to shutting those people out and to not building bridges and connections with people who are different from us. Because while, like in the days that my father grew up, for example, in a small village in India, you could do that and be perfectly happy. You didn't have to reject anyone because there was no one else not like you. In the modern world, to only associate with your in-group, the people who think like, look like, and have same experiences as you, means that you are likely brushing past or rejecting people who have different experiences and backgrounds. And that rejection can be bad for them and for us. Instead, what I would say is there's an extraordinary opportunity here that our ancestors did not have, growing up in largely homogeneous villages where there was no real opportunity for travel outside. And the opportunity that we have is to recognize that there's a lot more that we don't see, a lot that's below the surface in people, such as our shared values and experiences, that can serve as a powerful foundation for connection. Connection is important not just because connection makes us feel good, but it's actually important in the modern world to strengthening society. And this is a really critical point I want to make because building stronger connections is the foundation for strong communities, for strong nations, and for a strong world. Because it turns out that if you don't have strong connections with people, you actually can't dialogue with them. Because it's when we are connected with people that we're able to pause and truly listen to what they're saying. It's when we're able to give them the benefit of the doubt before jumping to conclusions. So it turns out that a relationship is a foundation for dialogue. And if you're worried that there's great polarization in the world today, that it's hard for us to actually come together and address big problems like climate change or economic inequality or difficulties that we have with health and chronic disease, then we have to think, how do we build stronger connections with one another, including especially people who are not like us, so that we can dialogue better, so that we can build a stronger, more cohesive society. So that's where I think this connection becomes really important. And I'll just mention lastly, just something about our biology and evolution. When we're born, we don't discriminate between people of different races. That's not ingrained in us to treat people differently based on how they look or their backgrounds. This is one of the gifts of children. And you have kids and I have kids. And for all of those out there who either have kids or who have supported children in your lives, you know that children give us a front row seat to how we were originally programmed. And what I see in my 4-year-old and in my 2.5-year-old and Tejas and Shanti every day is that even though they have their moments where they fight and they yell and they have tantrums, their default state is to reach out with kindness and compassion to others, whether it's their grandparents or new kids or to each other, because that's actually how we're hardwired. But what happens over time is we take in all these messages and we learn a different way of being, a way of being that tells us, okay, we have our group and everyone else is a separate group and there are lines that divide us and we can't connect. But that is learned. And so to me, Maya, the journey to building a connected life is not an effort to transform us into something we're not. It's an effort to return to who we fundamentally are. And still, we still are that person that is hardwired to connect with one another. But what we have to do is remember it. We have to build on that. And if we do that, we can become the deeply interconnected people that I believe we were ultimately designed to be.
I have one more question for you. Women who are in relationships, they might have small children and they feel lonely. How do they know whether it's the relationship or whether they have to look outside it? Because I think that there's a lot of societal expectation or the Cinderella complex that having a partner will complete you and you will never be lonely again. And if you are lonely, it means that the relationship is wrong. But for a long time, I've thought if I didn't have my girlfriends and my family, I couldn't stay married to my partner because he's not enough. I love him, but I need other things. Yeah. How can you tell?
Gosh, I mean, you ask all the right questions. This is really common challenge that people have for exactly the reason you said. Because we were brought up in a culture that tells us you find that one person and your life is complete. And that's just not how we're built. We need intimate connections, we need friends, and we need community. We need all three. And so the challenge with this situation you're describing, and it's a really interesting situation because loneliness among parents, especially new parents, is really common. But it's not something that people talk about very much, including the parents themselves, because at some level, it almost feels selfish to say, wow, I just had this beautiful child, but I'm lonely. But it's a reality because your life is turned upside down. You're not seeing your friends, etc. Sometimes it's not easy to know, though, if the problem is that you're not seeing your friends enough, or that there's something going on in your relationship with your partner that's a problem, or if you're missing a sense of connection to a community. And so in those moments, what we have to do is we have to actually experiment a bit. And it was very interesting. In the writing of this book, I talked to a number of psychologists about how they manage this exact challenge. And what many of them said is, yes, while there are fancy diagnostics that they can try to do here and there, at the end of the day, we have to experiment. So for example, if one possibility is that it's a lack of connection, that's a challenge here, then simply making a few minutes, 15 minutes, a couple of times a week to talk to, or to, on the phone or to video conference with, or just to write to someone you care about could be an interesting experiment to say, how does that make me feel? If it's with your partner that you're worried, maybe we have a challenge connecting here, then again, there too, keeping some time, and it doesn't have to be a lot. It can be 15 minutes, 20 minutes, just to do something together. It could be take a walk together. It could be to talk about something important that you've been mulling over, or something that happened at work that day together. That can be a powerful experiment too. I always pay attention myself, not always just to how I feel during the interaction, but how I feel immediately after. I feel like that is the biggest tell for me. I used to call it my turnaround test. When I'm turning around and walking away, how do I feel? And that's a very powerful indicator, because that's usually when you've stopped performing
Yeah.
and you can just let yourself be who you are and feel what you feel. And that's often very telling. And so in these ways, I think if we are able to experiment, sometimes it tells us what's going on. Like for me, when I experienced that deep loneliness after leaving government, what I ended up experimenting with how to help me understand what was really going on, is I had these two friends, Dave and Sunny, who I loved dearly but never saw and didn't talk to nearly enough. But I ran into them at this conference. This is about a year after I was no longer in government. And we had one of those conversations that we all have with friends. Oh my gosh, wouldn't it be great if we saw each other more often? We really have to get together more. But then we had this sinking feeling it just wasn't going to happen. So finally, at the end of the walk, we stopped and I just said, what if we made a commitment to each other that once a month we were going to talk by video conference for like an hour, and we were going to give each other the benefit of our full attention. We weren't going to be emailing and stuff. We're just going to focus on each other. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to be real with each other. We're going to talk about the stuff that is really on our mind, especially the stuff that we tend not to talk about with our friends, which is our relationships, our health, and our finances. And then the last thing that we said is that in between those monthly calls, if something comes up, we're worried about something that's going on with an argument we had with our partner, or some opportunity comes up at work that we're confused about, and we're not sure, should we take this opportunity or not, that we're just going to have a text thread that we use to reach out to one another to say, hey, something came up. Can you hop on the phone? And even if we can only do that for 5 minutes, it's okay. Because 5 minutes every couple of days or once a week is better than an hour, every few months. But a little bit goes a long way. And so we did that. And I will tell you that over the next year, that group that I called my moai, which is a Japanese term I talk about in the book, but that moai changed my life. Those two, Sunny and Dave, helped me make some extraordinarily important decisions. But more importantly, they made me realize what my good friend from medical training had told me all those months ago, that I actually really did have friendships, but I was not experiencing friendships. And they helped me realize that relational loneliness was really what was driving my overall experience of loneliness.
And just like you can be lonely in a room full of people, or a house full of people, or a bed full of people, if you live alone or you're single, that doesn't necessarily mean you're lonely, does it? It's not a guarantee.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, in fact, the story of many single people, and this has been studied at length, is even though, yes, if you are living alone, you may be at greater risk in some studies of loneliness. That does not mean you're consigned to a life of loneliness. And in fact, many people who live alone have incredibly rich social lives and networks. But I do worry about people who live alone in this time of COVID, because this is a very unusual situation where we're not allowed to, in a sense, act on many of those rich networks we have, which is why I think actually in this time, if we want to pursue the path of social revival and not social recession, there are some simple things I think we do need to do to strengthen our connections. I talked earlier about the importance of putting a little bit of time aside on a regular basis for people we care about. You'd be surprised at how much 15 minutes a day can do to help you feel more deeply connected. And it's because we're hardwired to connect. We respond so quickly when we have an opportunity to authentically connect with others. But the other thing that we can do if we really want to strengthen our connection in this moment of COVID and even afterward is we can focus on the quality of time we have with one another. And the easiest way to quickly increase the quality of your connection is to eliminate distraction when you're talking to other people. To not do email, check your social media feed, look at the news, Google questions that popped into your head. We do those things because we think I can multitask, but science is very clear that we can. A couple of things I should mention here that can help us in this moment is actually service. And this is one of the realizations I had in the writing and research of this book. Something I was taught by people through their stories was that service is one of the most powerful antidotes we have to loneliness. And the reason is because loneliness triggers this very unusual state in us where we turns our attention inward because we experience a state of threat, and we are hyper vigilant because we're worried about threats. So we're more likely to perceive someone with good intentions as perhaps having nefarious intentions around us. And this all makes evolutionary sense because when we were cast out from our hunter-gatherer tribe thousands of years ago and were alone on the tundra, we needed to be hyper vigilant. We needed to be focused on ourselves because safety truly was an issue. But in the modern world, that pushes us away from other people. And our self-esteem can erode the longer we're lonely because we convince ourselves that we're lonely because we're not likable. This is where service comes in because it breaks that downward spiral. It refocuses our attention on other people in the context of a positive interaction. But it also reminds us that we have something beautiful to bring to the world. It reminds us that we have value, that we have worth. And in this moment of COVID, you might think, I can't go out to my soup kitchen in my community or volunteer at my church in the way I used to. But I will tell you this, there are more people in need who are struggling, who need help and support. And many of them are people you know. And simply reaching out to a friend to see how they're doing, or reaching out to a neighbor who may be scared to go to the grocery store because they're worried about COVID and maybe worried about food, offering to virtually babysit for your friends who have kids and are struggling to figure out how to manage work and homeschooling and everything. These are simple but powerful ways that we can serve, and through our service, we connect. With all of this, I think one thing that we can't lose sight of is that the foundation for connecting with other people is a deep connection with ourselves. And one of the most powerful things that makes us connected to ourselves is actually time in solitude. And this is really counterintuitive, right? Because you might think, gosh, how is solitude connected to social?
Improving loneliness, yeah.
Right. But it turns out that moments of solitude are when we let the noise around us settle. It's when we allow ourselves to reflect, to think, to simply be. It's when we allow ourselves to just settle into our bodies and into our minds in a way that's unfettered by the outside world and by the expectations of other people. And that could be just a few minutes that we spend sitting on the front porch, feeling the breeze against our face. It could be a few minutes that we spend in meditation or in prayer or listening to music that centers us. It could be a walk in the park or some time spent in nature. However you find your solitude, solitude is that force that helps ground us and center us. And it doesn't take necessarily a lot of time to do it. You don't need to go on a retreat for 7 days, to find solitude, although that might help many people. But the reason this is critical is because when we approach other people and our interactions from a place of being grounded and centered, we're more able to listen to the other person, to hear them, to be fully present, as opposed to be fixated on how we're coming across or on being who we think they want us to be. This is really, a really critical point. And I mention it because in our extroverted world, time for solitude can often be poo-pooed and put aside as unnecessary or as something you do if you don't have friends. But solitude serves a much, much more important role than that. And if you're out there and you're listening, you're thinking, gosh, it sounds amazing, but I don't have time for solitude. My life is just really, really busy. I'm a busy parent. I've got work. I'm trying to do all this stuff. Then I would just remind you about my nephrology teacher, my kidney teacher from medical school, who had this beautiful thing that she would do each day. And she was incredibly busy. I don't know if I'll ever be as busy as she was in my life. She was a mom to 2 boys. She was a teacher. She was an administrator at the medical school. She was a doctor taking care of patients and running a major center in the hospital. I mean, she did it all. But what she used to do before she saw a patient is she would turn on the tap and let the warm water run over her hands for about 20 seconds. And as it was running over her hands, she would take a deep breath and she would remember the things in her life that she was grateful for. Maybe that day it was the hug that her sons gave her. Maybe it was the medical student that she taught earlier that day who finally had a concept click. Maybe it was the privilege of taking care of the patient who she was about to go see. And then she would turn off the tap. She would take a deep breath and she would walk into that patient's room feeling more centered, more grounded, and more able to be who she really was. That to me is the power of what just 20 seconds can do in terms of making us feel more centered. And I think this is important for us to build into our lives because this is our reset moment. COVID-19 is our opportunity, as painful as it is, as hard as it is, because so many of us are not only having our lives turned upside down, but we've lost loved ones. We've had many more loved ones who have probably gotten sick and are struggling. But this is our moment to reset and ask ourselves, how do we build a life that is truly centered around people? Because a people-centered life is the life where we think about our relationships and we prioritize them and where we put our time and our attention and our energy. And if we live a people-centered life, we make it possible to build a people-centered world. And that is one where we actually design our workplaces to strengthen connection, where we design our school curricula in ways that teach our children that from the earliest of ages about how to build healthy relationships. This is what's possible. Out of great strife and chaos can come extraordinary growth and a recentering and a reordering of our priorities. And my hope is that we will be able to use this COVID-19 moment to strengthen our relationships and build that people-centered world that I want for my kids, and for all our children.
Mine too, Vivek. That's my hope. And thank you for everything that you're doing to help highlight this important issue. Speaking of priorities, you've got one on your lap. He's been very patient. Sending lots and lots of love. It's been gorgeous speaking to you. I feel so soothed and inspired and motivated to go and strengthen some of my social connections.
Oh, well, thank you, man. It was so nice to talk to you. And I know my son Tejas here, he's sitting on my lap and he joins me for a lot of these calls. Mama, you want to say hi? Say hi. I mean, it's sort of appropriate, in fact, that he joined, because the reason I really wrote this book, and the reason I decided when I came out of government and asked myself that question, what can I do that would actually be meaningful and would contribute to the world in a way that feels good? I kept thinking about him and his little sister, my daughter Shanti. Because as I think about the world, man, I know that despite being the overprotective parent I am, that I can't protect them from all the pain that's out there and from disappointment and suffering. But what I do hope is that as they go out into the world, that they will find people who are willing to give them the benefit of the doubt when they make a mistake, who are willing to help them up when they stumble and fall down, literally and figuratively. But that will only be true if each of us in our own ways takes it upon ourselves to help create a world that's more fueled by love and compassion and kindness. Because right now the world is swirling in fear, and that fear is giving rise to anger and to jealousy and to rage and to insecurity. And it's infecting our relationships, our organizations, our neighborhoods, and our politics. Reversing that starts with the steps we take in our life to center our lives more around love. And to me, what that means is thinking about how can we choose love over fear when we make decisions on how we treat other people, as we make decisions on what issues we choose to speak up on in the public square, as we decide what work to engage on in the world, as we decide who to vote for in the ballot box. The most important thing that we can do is to support actions and people and causes that reflect that most fundamental value of love. And I say that as a doctor who has written prescriptions for many types of medicines over the years, but who now fully appreciates that there is no medicine that is more powerful when it comes to healing than love. And you don't need an MD or a medical license to be able to dispense that. All of us have the power to heal because all of us have the power to love. And our relationships are so powerful because they are the vehicle through which we experience that love, through which we give and receive it.
Every so often, I interview someone on No Filter and people just start reaching out and saying, oh my God, I thought it was just me until I heard that interview. And now I understand my own reactions or my own feelings to something so much better than I did before. And I'm thinking particularly about an episode that I did with David Gillespie about psychopaths, not the serial killer kinds of psychopaths, but the ones who walk among us and live among us. And a few people in the editing process have listened to this interview with Vivek, and already I've had people here at Mamamia reaching out and saying, oh my God, I think my dad's lonely, or I think my partner's lonely, or, oh, that really spoke to me because that's how I feel, but I thought it was just me. You can get a copy of Vivek's book Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World from any good bookstore, and we will put a link in the show notes. I really hope this interview has helped you and has made you feel seen and heard and understood, which is what we always try to do here at Mamamia. Please send it to someone if you feel that it could help them feel seen and heard and understood as well. And of course, if this issue has brought up some distressing feelings for you, please reach out to Lifeline on 13 11 14. This episode was produced by Leah Porges. The executive producer of No Filter is Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and I'll see you on mamamia.com.au.